So this is a huge PowerPoint compared to the other two. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through it. I'm going to skip some parts that may be not particularly useful, or if I realize that we are taking too much time on your moment, and you're going to have the PDF of this thing later to consult. So if you have any questions or you want to, any clarification or whatever, I will be still available for you personally till this Saturday or by email in eternity from here. So, this is about papyrology, my beloved discipline. Usually I do not tell people that I'm a papyrologist. I try to, pass it into silence because there's no need really. But sometimes they ask what I do for a living. And when I say I'm a papyrologist, I inevitably get this answer. Oh, so you can read hieroglyphics. And you have no idea of the disappointment on their faces when they realize that no, I do not read hieroglyphics, or at least some papyrologists can. I can't, personally. Why? Because it's not specifically the discipline. To a point, papyrology and Egyptology are two different disciplines. And where lies the difference? Well, in a very matter-of-fact problem, Egyptology is about Egypt when Egypt is its own kingdom, an independent power, a great power in Middle Eastern politics. You have a curriculum of Assyrian studies. Now, Assyriology and all the Middle Eastern kingdoms have had to deal with Egypt at some point, and it's a country with a strong and charismatic culture. Think of the paintings, think of the Nile, the agriculture, think of the pyramids. That's Egyptology, and that's hieroglyphics. Papyrology actually is concerned with what happened in Egypt when Egypt was no longer, and not yet, a sovereign state. A huge gap of almost more than 1 millennium when Egypt was no longer its own sovereign power. And secondly, it was born in a specific historical circumstances. Why? When Egyptian papyri in languages other than Egyptian, you will see which ones, flooded European excavations and institutions, so around late 19th century onwards. Now, you may object that Egypt was no longer a sovereign state before Alexander the Great's conquest, and yet, yes, it was invaded by the Hyksos, which were basically a local population, by Assyrians, by Persians, but it always recovered its own sovereignty. We have pharaohs after the Assyrian period, we have pharaohs after the Persian period. What we don't have is a pharaoh, technically speaking, after the conquest by Alexander the Great. Egypt ceases to be a sovereign power, or yes, it is, but the conquering dynasty, the ruling dynasty, is Macedonian and Greek in origin, and there is a Greek and Macedonian colonization. And the language of administration is Greek. So I wouldn't call that a sovereign state, rather a land of colonization. And this is the so-called papyrological millennium, where papyrology usually comes into its own, what we call Ptolemaic Egypt, the period when Egypt was under the dynasty of Ptolemeus son of Lagos, Alexander the Great's general. It ends in 30 BC, you all know why, because Octavian and Agrippa defeat Antony and Cleopatra, seize control of Egypt, and that's the end of the last Hellenistic kingdom and the beginning of Egypt as a Roman province. Now, Egypt doesn't really stop being a Roman province in 285, but Diocletian comes into power and starts a lot of political, economical, and administrational reforms that start conventionally what we call late antiquity. Things in Egypt do change a bit in terms of administration, which means that we now speak of not of Roman but of late antique Egypt. Sometimes you will hear about Byzantine Egypt. I don't very much like the term, because what is Byzantine? I would start using the term after Heraclius and after the Arab conquest, when it makes no longer sense of speaking of an Eastern Roman Empire. But since 641, to the Arabic conquest, Egypt is part of Roman Empire. Only it's an Eastern Roman Empire from 392 onwards, 395, sorry. Arabic Egypt is again its own matter. It starts with the Arab conquest in Egypt, and we conventionally have it last till 15th century AD, when the Ottomans take power in Egypt, but actually papyrology ends much before that, when paper starts being used in the East. So I'd say roughly 10th to 11th century, because papyrus is then no longer used as a writing system, and then we have no longer written documents in papyrus, therefore no longer we have papyrology. Yes, that's what I was going to say. When paper replaces papyrus, that's the so-called papyrological millennium. It's roughly 1,000 years. What happens afterwards? Egypt is an eyalet within the Ottoman Empire. It remains, again, land of conquest and colonization until 1805, when the Khedivate starts, this Muhammad Ali Pasha, nominally still under control of the Ottoman Empire, in fact its own kingdom, and the British Empire didn't like that. So from 1882 to 1956, there's a British protectorate on Egypt. Egypt is only partially a sovereign country, and that's Queen Mary in the picture, the wife of King George V. Have you seen The Crown on Netflix? No? Well, if you haven't, I would warmly advise it, because in 1956 there's an incident in Suez, which is amply covered by this series on Netflix, which explains you why Britain is no longer in possession of Egypt and of the Suez Canal. But anyways, Egypt is now a sovereign state, whichever its government. But it remained the British, not actually a colony like Kenya or Ghana or South Africa. It's only partially sovereign, but still there was a foreign power in control. And when the Brits arrived, they were followed by French, Germans, Italians, all excavating in the country, mostly archaeologists. But of course they were looking for papyri sometimes, because they realized that, oh my God, this country is brimming, is full of written testimonies in 1,000 languages, perfectly preserved by the warm and dry weather in the country. Everything that is thrown in the desert stays in the desert. In the same way you have a frozen mammoth in the lands of Siberia, because ice, like warm sand, preserves everything. When I speak of British archaeologists, I think of Bernard Pine Grenfell and Arthur Hunt, for instance. This is probably the most famous couple of properly papyrologists. They were British. They excavated in what is now Beneza, and which was back then Oxyrhynchus, roughly in the middle course of the Nile. It's a famous couple because they retrieved all the collections of papyri they gathered are now the Oxyrhynchus papyri. They are mostly preserved in Oxford, and it's still, together with the Teptunis papyri in Berkeley, I'd say is the largest collection of manuscripts of written artifacts in the Western Hemisphere. Because of course all these things were brought out of Egypt, and you don't want to know, or if you want to know, there's a lot of bibliography about it, of the political problems these excavations of course triggered, because back then Egypt was not a completely sovereign country. So technically what you bought from the market in Egypt was perfectly legal for you to own and bring outside the country, even if it was illegally acquired. And whatever you excavated in Egypt, you could actually bring it out of the country. Deals were made with the institutions like the Cairo Museum, the Cairo Institute for Antiquity, but these deals were not always honored, and a lot of collections in Europe, in America, in Australia are still, you know, very much on the line between legal and illegally acquired, which means there's a lot of discussion about repatriation. Egypt is not happy with half of its wealth in written artifacts being dispersed around the world, and we probably will not hear the end of this problem till the 30th century or whatever. The likely side of this is that the wealth, the quantity of retrieved objects is astonishing. We have retrieved tons of papyri fragments. We still find tons of papyri fragments in Egypt, and they contain both documents of everyday life of Greco-Egyptians during the papyrological millennium and also in a smaller measure, because culture is always a luxury in any country, in any age. Also literature, Greek literature, Egyptian literature, and sometimes even Latin literature, you will see. And that's how it was born. We call it Papyrology because it started with papyri. We refer to Egypt because it started in Egypt. But in the 20th century, we opened different fields of inquiry for this discipline. We no longer are attached to papyri only, and we no longer look only to Egypt for our discoveries. We can go beyond, materially speaking, papyrus itself. Yes, of course, this remains the most important object because of sheer quantity. Papyrus preserves very well in the sand, and Egypt produced papyrus, of course, so there's no way of escaping it. Papyrus will remain pivotal in papyrology. But there's also a huge quantity of ostraka, or potsherd. Easier to provide than papyrus because you only have, if you have a flower vase or on your roof, you know, tiles on your roof, you just break it, there's an ostrakon. It's very easy to provide, it's very easy to write in, and we have tons of ostraka, not just in Egypt, but all over the empire, territory of the empire. And then, of course, there's the classical way the Romans learned to write and read, the wax or wooden tablets. It's a nice image. I know it's from Wikipedia. I haven't found anything better, I'm sorry. When we come to parchment, the thing is a bit more complicated because we have codexes in parchment from Egypt. Yes, we have also rolls of parchment. But there's the problem that parchment comes into its own quite late in the history of Egypt, and we overlap with codicology, paleography, and generally speaking, all the great Byzantine studies. Because Byzantine codexes are in parchment too. And whoever studies Byzantine manuscripts of Greek literature must consider the earliest samples of codexes in parchment from Egypt the beginning of its area of study. But these also belong to papyrology, so areas of research overlap, and polite researchers do not quarrel. And if they quarrel, they always make peace. Like, for instance, the Codex Sinaiticus. This was found in Sinai, again, in Egypt, in the 4th AD. It contains the 4 Gospels. It's perfectly preserved now in Vatican Library. Okay, does this belong to Byzantine studies or to papyrology? My answer is both, for several reasons. Well, yes, it belongs to the tradition of parchment codexes, which will go forward in Byzantium till they are replaced by paper codexes. But if you look at the layout is literally the same you find in literary papyri rolls. Short, narrow columns, annotations in the margins. So to a papyrologist, this can say a lot in terms of literary papyri and of preservation of literature, even Christian texts, in the history of Western culture. So yeah, we both, papyrologists and codicologists, or Byzantinologists, as you want to call them, can profit from this thing. So once again, we do not quarrel, but we share. To sum up, papyrology is about everything that is not on stone or wall. What is on stone or what is written on wall is usually in the domain of epigraphic studies and epigraphists. With exceptions, because honestly, writings on wall, if you are a papyrologist who is particularly interested in the history of writing, writings on walls could be interesting to you too, not just to epigraphists. Instead, I mean, stones and inscriptions are always done in beautiful capital writings, and once you got to understand it, the point is in the content rather than in writing. So you might be less interested in that. And of course, there's the problem of geography. Now, of course, most of the available evidence comes from the eastern deserts and steppe. Syria, Mesopotamia, that's not a desert, but that's an arid steppe, a very arid and warm environment, a very dry environment, where papyri can prosper and have prospered. Syria, Palestine, the same thing. Think of the scrolls of the Dead Sea, think of a lot of papyri found in Jerusalem, and of course Egypt, with its beautiful desert encompassing all the country except for the Nile. But there's a little more than that. Ostraka have been found, for instance, in the remnants of Roman Africa, Numidia, Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria, mostly from late antiquity and the Vandal period of Africa, Latin Ostraka. And there's a lot of them, most of them still unpublished. From Spain, from Visigothic Spain, we have the equivalent of Ostraka, las pizarras visigodas. I'm using the Spanish term because that's the way they were published. Tablets were found in Dacia, in Roman Dacia, not a lot of them, but from Alburnus Mayer, from the gold mines that were basically the reason why Trajan invaded. Pottery, surviving pottery in Latin from La Grove-Sainte in France. It was a workshop of Gallic pottery, which was exported all over the empire in the 1st and 2nd century AD. So we have written artifacts from there too. I should mention the Vindolanda tablets. They are a famous corpus published now in England by Tomlinson, by J.D. Thomas, by all the creme de la creme of British papyrologists, and they were found in close to the Adriatic wall. They are in wood. They were miraculously preserved in the basement of a building close to the wall because they were in anoxic conditions. There was no oxygen, and that's why they were preserved in such a wet climate as what Britain had. By the way, I was told that when they were first discovered that the stench was unbearable because we're speaking of rotten wood from 2000 years ago. And of course there's a lot of papyri from Italy, referring mostly to Ostrogothic and Lombard Italy because they are acts from the local churches when they were selling or buying or renting land to privates, and they were therefore preserved in archives quite well. And of course there's the Herculaneum papyri. I mean, when the Vesuvium erupts over you, it carbonized everything. A lot of tablets and a lot of papyri survived in the process and are now being painstakingly analyzed and read despite their horrific conditions. So papyrology can take everything and is interested in everything, even if we border very much with the Middle Ages, because 8th century, 9th century, in Italy, in the West, we are now speaking of Middle Ages, no longer of late antiquity. In Africa, I'd say till the Arab conquest, we are still in late antiquity, but I'm not repeating the Pirenne thesis to you, already know it. Also, the fun part is that we can deal with a lot of languages with papyri. Of course, in Egypt, most of the papyri will be in Greek or in Egyptian. Greek stays mostly written in the same way. Egyptian is at the beginning written in Demotic alphabet, which is a simplified version of hieroglyphs and hieratic alphabet. In late antiquity, the Egyptians used the Greek alphabet and add some signs to the Greek alphabet to cover some of the phonemes, the phones they had in their own language, and invent what we now call the Coptic alphabet, which is a major vessel for Coptic culture and Christianity in Egypt. It lasts a few centuries after the Arab conquest because it's a writing for the Egyptian language, even if the alphabet is Greek. We even have papyri in Pelevi, for the short period when Egypt was a Sasanian province, before Heraclius took it back. And there's a few, very few papyri in Latin language. It's incidentally the topic I have been most invested in these years, as you will see the day after tomorrow. So, and of course, there's a lot of Arabic papyri. Mostly studied right now in Egypt, I think, and in Vienna. There's a flourishing school about Arabic papyrology, because of course everyone is interested in a clash of the 1,000-year-old Graeco-Roman Egypt and the new culture, the new Muslim culture entering this country and starting, administering it with Greek language. But then again, Greek is slowly replaced by Arabic in administration. So you have a lot of these documents. It's very fun to see how the Greek alphabet tries to tries to render the Arabic language. So, for instance, one of the first famous caliphs of Egypt, Qurra ben Sharik, the way the Greeks try to transliterate its name in 1,000 different ways because they don't have the phones, they don't have the right sounds in the language to render it. But don't forget that the situation as it is in Egypt might have been completely different if we moved to a country where Greek was not spoken. Now, to be very quick, because of course, in Roman Empire we have a language barrier. To the right you have Greek-speaking countries, to the left you have the Latin-speaking West. And in the Latin-speaking portion, it's difficult to find Greek papyri. You usually find Latin material crossing with languages that were already spoken there. Now, we have no evidence of Dacian language from the Dacian tablets, definitely no evidence of Brighton, language from the Vindolanda tablets. And I mean, the Latin of the Pizarras Visigothas is already a Latin heavily mixed with the Visigothic language, which is a Germanic language, but we have something among the Latin Ostraka, especially the one found in Libya in 1984, close to this farming complex, close to the Wadi El Amud. These Ostraka are still unpublished, as far as I know. They are preserved in Manchester because the excavating people were from Manchester, Libyc and British. It was a joint Romano-Libyan expedition. But the fun thing is that these are written in Latin alphabet, but Neo-Punic in language. We have a few evidence of Neo-Punic language from inscriptions. We have evidence of Berber language, sometimes, especially in onomastics, but we didn't have Ostraka in Neo-Punic. Especially we didn't have Ostraka in Neo-Punic and Latin alphabet, which tells you a lot about what sort of writing education these people underwent. Because they were using the only alphabet they knew, and that was the Latin, but the language was their own, the Neo-Punic one. Now these things are unfortunately still unpublished, so I cannot say any more about them. But still, if we move to from Egypt to another country, the language, the logic of the languages change completely. By the way, they understood that they were Neo-Punic, and they also tried, this is a French paleographer who started studying them but had no time to do it, but he realized, once again like the Coptic speaking Egyptians, that Romano-Libyan people started adding to the Latin alphabet a few graphemes reproducing the Neo-Punic language, because there was no equivalent in the Latin alphabet. So people adapted the Latin alphabet to their own needs, both in Egypt and in Libya. Now, I haven't told you exactly what the aim of papyrology is. I just told you it studies document, yes, but it's a bit more complex than that. There are layers about it. You can just stick to the document. That would be the Italian way, I'd say, because of course we are the people who study and forget about the world outside, because the only important thing is the thing we are studying, right? So you read the document. Sometimes it entails decipherment because the document is badly preserved, or it's in a writing you don't know, so you have to study to practice it to understand it. Then you reconstruct the text if the text is incomplete. Sometimes you can do it with the right formulae which appear identical from a document to another. And then you give the translation of the piece and a commentary in which you explain to me, the reader, who wrote the thing, why they wrote it, when they did that, and what was their purpose. That's the analysis of the single document that is expected of you as papyrologists. Now, the Anglo-Saxons will try to say no. No, you must put a document in its historical context, otherwise it's completely useless to publish it. So the microcosm of the document, yes, but the macrocosm of, say, the economy in Greco-Roman Egypt, the policy, the politics of Roman Empire in Egypt thanks to the papyri. So from one side we have the act of just publishing manuscripts one after the other. A lot of old papyrologists in Italy literally spend their life just publishing one manuscript after the other, or republishing or restudying single manuscripts. And then you have the more pragmatical approach of the Anglo-Saxon academia, which is, yes, reading papyri is fun, but please put them in context with ancient history. I'm quoting Roger Begnall's book, Reading Papyri, Writing Ancient History, because this is, in a nutshell, the approach of the historian. Papyri as a source for ancient history, not just a discipline in itself, but a tool to make ancient history with a more precise means, with more detailed information. I mean, you can actually do both. Nothing prevents you from doing. I have collected for you a bit of some titles connected with papyrological articles. Like you can, for instance, I told you about the great historical context. Look, Emperor and Citizen in the Era of Constantine by Simon Corcoran. It's definitely something you need the papyri for. One script for 2 languages, Latin and Arabic in an early allographic papyrus, that's definitely concentrated on a single manuscript. But the historical importance of this thing is huge enough to warrant an article by itself. Or 3 notes on governors of Byzantine Egypt. This is definitely using just papyri, but it's trying, you know, to write the history of governorship in a specific period in late antique Egypt. That guy, Legatura ad Asso di Picche, is a paleographer, and he's using papyri to ascertain the birth and the development of a specific ligature, what we call the spade ace ligature, because it resembles, if you think of cards, it's a ligature epsilon rho, or AP in Latin, which is the ace of spade ligature, and it is definitely seen in papyri. So if you're a paleographer, you can just use them to do, you know, this sort of research. Papyri and imperial constitutions in Egypt, critical notes on the petitions in late empire, the legions of Thebes and the late antique Roman kingdom. It's Archive locale et Archive central en Egypte romaine. You can use papyri for literally everything: economic history, administration, history of Roman army, history of a late Roman Empire, or just by themselves to publish them, because at least you have to make them available to the scientific community. And then we come to the main difficulty in this thing. I am borrowing the words of Simon James in his monograph on papyri in Dura Europos on the Euphrates. He describes Dura papyri, the collection of papyri found in Dura Europos, but I think his words relate very much to papyrology at large. He says, while replete with astonishing detail, Dura's textual riches remain relative. The documentary record of the site remains highly fragmentary, providing more an irregular series of vivid stroboscopic flashes in the prevailing darkness than continuous illumination. Think of a road deep in the country with a few post lamps at very far intervals. Yes, they definitely enlighten, they definitely illuminate the vicinity, but they leave huge parts of the road in total darkness. You may try to walk it and kind of surmise what the road is about, if there are sands, if there are stones, holes, wolves, traps, but it's still in darkness. That's the point with papyri. A papyrus in itself can tell you a lot about who wrote it, why did they write it, and the reason for its composition and all the details of its own composition, but it may not tell you much, even if you put it in context with other papyri, with the general situation of the people involved. It may, sometimes it does, but most of the times it's really a vivid flash in darkness. Also, it's materially very fragile. Again, this is Clark Hopkins, who participated in the excavation in Dura Europos in the 1930s, and that's how he describes the first papyri findings in Dura. Not really different from what happened in Egypt most of the times. He says, south of the wrongly inscribed steps, almost on the edge of the ravine, we found papyri, masses of papyri. Papyri on which letters were strong and clear, but in which not a single whole word remained. The letters were preserved as print in the dust, printed, as it were, on the dust, and to the dust they quickly returned. The documents had been tied into bundles. While the letters of ink remained intact, the papyri in which they were written had long ago dissolved into dust. Now, the situation is not always tragic like this. But if you deal with papyri, you must expect the worst conditions ever, so that you don't get disappointed. If you don't expect the best, always expect the worst, so you won't be disappointed. It's a rule for life, not just for Philology. Should you ever want, by the way, to tackle the single documents, I'm going to give you a list of search engines. There's now a decent number of them. You can look for papyri with these search engines. It only serves an internet connection. There may be a problem with Trismegistus because Trismegistus is now under subscription. So there's a beta version for open access, but your institution should pay for a subscription, or otherwise you just ask me, and I'll give you the screenshot because of course amicizia papyrologorum, they say, we help each other. They're slightly different from, one is slightly different from the next in aim, in quantity of data, in main material represented, in metadata and languages, but you can use them in both ways, like you know a text, then you track down metadata on the text, because you need to know where it was published, for instance, or what it contains, or its data, its dating. Or if you have the metadata, like you know when it was written, by whom, in what language, you need to know what was the name of the papyrus or its full text. You can do both these operations with metadata if you use them wisely. Be careful because of Eurocentrism and because papyrology was born in European states at the end of the 19th century, the search engines on papyri, when they were started, they covered Greek and Latin. They did not cover Demotic, Arabic, and Coptic texts until very recently. We have had several projects starting which cover Coptic and Demotic and Arabic papyri. Just give them time. It's going to be the work of a generation. Most of these search engines are made on a voluntary basis because there's no money to pay the guy who organized them. Now, the main one is Trismegistus on the top of it. It's the one we all use, and again, it's the one which requires subscription. But again, if you need information more than the information you are provided for with the beta version, email me. I'll look for the object and send you the screenshot. The other are mostly open access. The Leuven database of ancient books is focused on literary papyri, like the digital corpus of literary papyri once again. They don't give you texts, but metadata. The texts are supposed to be in the paper editions, mostly. Papyri.info and the checklist of editions, these give you the text of the documents, mostly. There's a lot of them on papyri.info, and it is completely open access. If you're interested in paleography, PapPal gives you the images of dated Greek artifacts from Egypt, so that you can establish what Greek writing looked like in a specific period of time. And again, Bibliographie Papyrologique en ligne is a bibliographical database if you need information, and of course the Arabic Papyrology database, as I was telling you, is one project already very much progressed about Arabic papyri. And of course, every collection of papyri in the world usually has its own database, like the Berliner Papyrusdatenbank, BERPAP, the APIS system of Michigan University. You go there, you browse them, you play for some hours, you will get the gist of it. you will know how to use them. Now, the question, I don't know if you guys are great travelers. I cannot say I am, but no, you don't have to work in Egypt, because actually collections of these artifacts are held in several institutions in Europe, in USA, in Australia. I put there just a bundle of names: Milano, Udine, Roma in Italy, Firenze also, in Germany, Hamburg, Berlin, Paris, in France, Freiburg, Gießen, once again in Germany, Leuven in Belgium, Oxford, Birmingham, Dublin in the United Kingdom, Berkeley, New York, and of course Ann Arbor in America. There's a collection in Tbilisi, or sorry, I put Tiflis, but then I realized that Tbilisi is the accepted name. Adelaide in Australia. I mean, there's a lot of them all around. Once again, because we bought and excavated in Egypt for decades, with all the consequent problems. They were done in a British protectorate, yes, but the British protectorate is now a sovereign state, which does not like its riches dispersed anywhere. Excavating, of course, in the oases of the Fayum, in places like Memphis, Gizeh, Antinopolis, Oxyrhynchus, Hermopolis, they excavated pretty much everywhere. But don't be careful, because now it's illegal to bring artifacts home. It all stays in Egypt, so if you found on the market a papyrus excavated in Egypt after the 70s, it shouldn't be there. That's black market, and you should charge, because it shouldn't. Several auction houses still sell papyri, and they're not particularly transparent on how they obtain them. There's also in eBay, by the way, if you check. I told you about Herculaneum papyri. You need to know that because it's like the technological frontier of papyrology, because to study them, they are putting them into, you know, the device that reads your body with X-ray. They do it with papyri because they are carbonized in bundles, and artificial intelligence now reconstructs the layers and gives you the text in the original columns for you to read it and translate it. They are doing wonders. And that's the part where I break my heart and tell you that actually not all that glitters is gold, which means we generally divide papyri, whatever the language, in literary or documentary. When I say papyri, I also mean Ostraka tablets and so on. The division is not always airtight. It serves the purpose of education and teaching rather than mirroring an actual situation. What's the difference? Of course, the distinction works until it doesn't. It's a distinction that encompasses on a larger layer the difference between book and document. A very fishy difference, but generally speaking, the book is a repository of knowledge, of literary text that you want to be permanent. You don't copy Euripides or Sophocles because you want them to vanish the next generation. You copy them because you feel then they are part of your cultural heritage and you want them to last forever. That's instead the document, usually a time-sensitive text that ceases to be relevant when people who need it cease to exist. My testament will stop being relevant after I die and my inheritance will be distributed. My income tax return is only worth of any attention by the fiscal system in Italy and will stop being relevant after I stop paying taxes because I die, etc., etc. Now, of course, or your private letters to your parents, to your partners, to your teachers. These only will be relevant to you and the people you are sending the communications, the letters. Now, of course, you may say, well, what of archives? What of public archives? Yes, that's the moment when the distinction is kind of slippery, kind of slopes, staggers, because of course there are documents which we want to preserve very much, especially like the Magna Carta, like the Declaration of Independence. but because they have a public, because from the beginning they have a public utility. And they don't hold, most of the times, literary texts, but pragmatic, important text for the moment they were composed. Of course, papyrology consented progress through both these categories and added a lot to our knowledge of antiquity and early Middle Ages. I mean, if we only speak of literary papyri, mostly hosted in papyri rolls, Latin volumen, plural volumina, well, there's a lot here to be said. Now, you all know probably that papyrus is a plant coming from Egypt. Its typical environment is shallow waters. There's a lot of about to say about its description and the way it was transformed in papyri rolls. There's a lot. Pliny has a lot to say, Naturalis Historia, about it, but I will not bore you with the particulars. Anyway, it's a very fun thing to read when you think that, I mean, Pliny gives you always the impression that he's dealing with incredibly important things and only understanding half of them. Sorry, Pliny, I know you're dead, but you always have the sensation that he is reporting everything and understanding a little less. But still, we are grateful because he reported everything. Without him, we would have very little. The roll is done when you cut stripes from the cortex of a papyrus plant, when you place them in two perpendicular layers, when you let them dry, pressing them together with a blunt object, waiting for the natural glue to pour from the dried fibers. And then you have the papyrus sheet, which you put together to form the roll. We have archaeological traces of ink pots and pens. We kind of know how they made the ink, mostly on a vegetable basis with intermissions with metal. By the way, the ink based on metal is the one that is more subject to corrode the fiber and eat it away. And that's the roll, which can be as long as you like. It is usually rolled around a wooden stick called navel or omphalos. And we have rich documentation of its usage from base paintings before we have actual rolls from Egypt, but mostly they're incomplete. A full, complete rolled roll you only can see in images. The fun thing is that in a country where Greeks were an element of intrusion and which we would expect would not have yielded much in terms of literature. I mean, where else would you read Greek literature if not in the Greek mainland, if not in Greece itself? And yet, Greco-Egyptians read a lot of Greek literature, a lot comparatively speaking, of course, and they produced a lot of books, of which we have now the remnants. The value, the priceless value of these objects is that they teach you a lot about how a book is conceived and made before we even knew that books existed. We don't have rolls from Greece mainland. We have very little from Greece, speaking of written artifacts, if not inscriptions in stone. But we have a lot from Egypt in terms of papyrus, of course. For instance, we have this almost complete roll from late 4th BC in Egypt, so at the beginning of Ptolemaic Egypt, which gave to us the text, otherwise it would be lost, of Timotheus of Miletus, this lyric choral piece called The Persians, detailing the Persian invasion. And we have here the first datable kind of instance of a book in Greek, the way Greeks in Egypt would read it and peruse it and, generally speaking, use it. Tells you a lot about the idea of layout. Could we now think of a book without page number, without margins, without paragraphs, without indentation? Could we think of poetry without separation between verses? No. But all these nice things I have told you about were born in a certain moment. Before that, they did not exist. Now, in normal editions, you will read Timotheus' Persians in the way Greek intellectuals define the division of verses, as you can find in Hephaestion, for instance. The colometry we have from the ancients is very precise, and when we speak of choral lyric, indentation and separation of verses, the verses are very short, right? But that's how late Greeks would read it. But a Greek of the 4th century BC would be accustomed to that. Continuous writing, no separation of lines, no regular columns, no punctuation, no minuscule writing, only a succession of letters as if this were a stone. Because of course everything comes from the stone. Writing was first done on stone. But we actually have a bit of layout in that respect. That thing above it, if you see it, called the coronis. It's an ibis, a bird, very stylized and associated with the paragraphos, horizontal bar. And notably after choreiais, the text stops. Why? Coronis and paragraphos, we don't know if they existed before the 4th century BC, but still, from the beginning, they helped the reader realizing that a section of the poem is finished, and we begin with something else. It's the first sign of layout of a text known to us in Greek literature, the very first, and it's a couple, by the way, which survived pretty much well. We keep finding it. That's from 2nd, 1st BC, Hyperides. That's the ending of Sappho's book 1. And once again, it is very much stylized here, but it's still associated with paragraphos here and here. Here also forked paragraphos. There's a dipla with it. Also, they finally invented, a little later, but they did it, the alignment in margins. This Pioxy 5 1844 is from Isocrates, and this time you have narrow and orderly columns, quite short, if I may say, and you also have wide margins. Margins that contain, for the first time, annotations. The practice of annotating literary texts began in Greek culture with this. If we go to the 2nd century, the 3rd century AD, there's this famous papyrus hosted in the British Library in London, the papyrus from Bacchylides, Epinicians and Dithyrambs. Now, the opera, the work originally was composed by Bacchylides in 6th BC. This Bacchylides was a contemporary to Pindar. They were rivals, arch rivals, some may say. So this time, the scribe who is copying down this work from Bacchylides is copying down something that was written 900 years before his own time. And what happens with poetry, if some time passes, you no longer understand it, because the language changes, because the vocabulary changes, the pronunciation of the language changes. Greeks from the 3rd century AD probably no longer had the idea of long and short syllable. The pronunciation of the vowels were completely different if you think of modern Greek. So what happens? They need a reading aid. So finally they start dividing the verses as they should. And they add above the letters a few signs which are the ancestors of the modern reading signs we now see in Greek, and not just in Greek. Or they would call them the prosodiae. That happened, for instance, also in this work of Sophocles, dated again in 3rd century AD. Sophocles lived in the 5th BC. And you have signs signaling the rough breathing, the acute accent, the long vowel, the apostrophos, all these things that were automatical in the head of a Greek reader of the 4th century BC are no longer automatical in a Greek reader of 5 centuries later, because the language has moved on. So all the reading aids we now use for writing, for reading poetry, very old, was born, culturally speaking, in the West with this. Chinese and Indian cultures have their own way, of course. I only know that. Because this collection of signs was transmitted from the Greeks to the Romans, and from the Romans to Middle Ages in Western Europe. Most of these signs we still use. We still use the acute and grave accent, we still use the rough and smooth breathing, we still use the circumflex accent. We no longer use very much the long and short vowel sign because they kind of know, but when dealing with metricals, with metrics, with meter, with Greek meter, we use it, and when dealing with Latin, we use it definitely. The apostrophos still exists. Hypodiastole and hyphen are no longer used in Greek orthography, but again, they were used to mark divisio verborum, holding letters together or separating them. But we now use for divisio verborum separation of words, so we no longer need them. Oh, by the way, there's a papyrus with the prosodia in it, because of course people needed a legenda, people needed a companion to remind themselves what these signs stand for. Also, and that's the fun part, we begin to see notes of, as I was telling you, marginal annotations also are notes of commentary to explain obscure expressions. Think of Aeschylus, almost incomprehensible for his contemporaries. But when you go to people 500 years later, he must have sounded completely alien. So they definitely needed reading aids in the form of commentaries. And since we are already closing to the hour, and I do not bore you further, I'm going to tell you the result of papyrology as finding out of texts. Because of course you know the pain for everyone who studies Greco-Latin, Greco-Roman literature is we are eating the crumbles of a huge banquet. Like you ask for chapakuli and they only give you the crumbs of the cheese. Because of course only 1% of Greco-Roman literature came to us. Now, I'm not saying that papyri overturned the situation, but still, thanks to papyri we can read complete works by Menander and Herondas, by Sappho, by Bacchylides, by Cercidas, and prose writers like Hyperides. And when I say complete works, I mean that we have a complete comedy of Menander, complete poems of Sappho and of Bacchylides, complete sections, shorter poems of Cercidas, and actually an entire oration from Hyperides, all from papyri. We read a lot of large fragments from lost works, by the way. Why Menander and Herondas are so important? Well, because Menander and Herondas are the basis for Plautus and Terence, who translated Menander comedies, and they arrived to the Renaissance theater, which arrived to the Italian movies of the 60s, which are full of Plautian tropes. Now, point is that before the papyri, where did Plautus and Terence take their works? We can only assume that Menander was great. No, now we have it, now we can read Menander, and we can appreciate what Plautus innovated from Menander and what he preserved, actually. The roots of Western theater, as we know it, are definitely, our understanding of it is definitely improved, because now we can read something more. And when I say large fragments from lost works, yes, fragments are small, but, I mean, Sophocles probably produced 120 plays in his life, Euripides 92, Aeschylus 70 to 90, and several satire plays, by the way. What do we have? 6 plus maybe 1 if Prometheus is by Aeschylus, 7 by Sophocles, and Pure Luck 19 by Euripides. And if we didn't have the second selection, we only have the Byzantine Triad, a very meager banquet. But now, thanks to Papyri, we have large and small fragments from tragedies and satire play, which clarify a lot the situation of what we knew about ancient theatre. For instance, we can read now large portions of The Net Fishermen or The Pilgrims by Aeschylus, and would you ever have thought that Aeschylus could be funny? But personally, never. I mean, think of the Agamemnon, funny? No, not at all. But these satire plays are actually funny. In The Net Fishermen, Danae is rescued from the casket by satyrs who try to fondle her and, you know, lull to sleep the baby Perseus and try, you know, to jump behind her, because of course they are satyrs, so they are sexually incontinent, and they start drinking. And fortunately, Danae is saved at the end of it by the king of the island she landed in. But it's comedy, basically. In the Pilgrims, is the satyrs going to Corinthus to participate in the Isthmian Games, unless Dionysus comes and say, nope, sorry, this is Poseidon, and you're devoted to me, not to another god. So now you come back, and they answer, but you had us sleep in the open, our backs are aching, we eat very badly, we no longer like you as a god protector, we want another god. Poseidon is the god we now want. And basically Dionysus yokes them to his chariot and whips them away from the scene. It's, okay, bitter comedy, but still comedy. But Aeschylus had a sense of humor. That's the greatest discovery the Papyri have made for us. If you think, this is just bibliography on Sophocles, okay? Okay, and just a selection. If you think of how much our colleagues were able to write on a single tragic author, of which only 7 plays survived, think of what we can do with a fragment. Probably triple this number. And perhaps avoid repeating ourselves, which is something that we sometimes do, because publish or perish, but I never said that. Again, Sappho, Bacchylides, these are poets which made a history of Roman poetry and of Renaissance poetry, and now we can read the original. And of course, philosophers like Epicurus, Philodemus, Chrysippus, and Antiphon, and Empedocles, we still can read fragments of these poets. I would also have a portion about documents, but I already trespassed on my times and on your patience, so you can look at the PowerPoint or ask me if you're curious. But that said, thank you very much for bearing with me.
I want to thank